Welcome to another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. I'm your host, James Gifford, and I'm joined tonight from two wonderful folks from scrum.org, and they're here to talk to us about evidence-based management. And so, coming to you from balmy Boulder, why don't you introduce yourself, Kurt?
I'm Kurt Bittner. I have done tons of things. I think next year it'll be 40 years since I got out of college and started doing, quote, real work, like the work I was doing before wasn't real, I guess. And what really interests me at this point in my life is kind of pushing a lot of the assumptions that organizations make and challenging the way that they think about what they're delivering. And we'll talk more about that later. But anyway, thanks for having us on, and I think it'll be an interesting chat.
And we also have Patricia Kong with us, and I really haven't seen Patricia since probably about 2016 at the Heart Agile conference in Philly. And it's honestly been that long since we've actually talked to each other.
Yeah. Hey. So I'm Patricia Kong. I am based in the Boston area. Kurt Bittner and I are basically yin and yang at scrum.org, thinking about, what do we call it now? Enterprise agility. And I am a recovering corporate-aholic, authoritarian-aholic. Like, who's the power? Who do I have to bow to and steal power from? That's what I'm trying to recover through every day.
Playing the corporate game is chess with real people.
I'm more of like a checkers kind of lady. So I
love me some checkers. So awesome. So I'm kind of really drawn to this topic and the content that you guys put out around this. Because I've been working with a lot of organizations over the years, kind of with my own kind of metrics framework that we really about flow metrics and focusing on outcomes, and then, where teams at with practices and things like that. And I think that you guys are, kind of timely with bringing this to market. Like it has a lot of good content that really gets people focused on, making decisions with data and having the right data to kind of achieve goals. And so I find this topic really interesting because it's been my coaching kind of stance. Not that I do actually much coaching, I just point out problems and then help them solve it. But I think that this approach to kind of management and leadership is in the right way, at least in my heart and where I gravitate to. So I'd love to kind of just really have a conversation with you guys about it tonight. And, we'll kind of just kick it over to Kurt or Patricia. You guys fight it out. Who wants to kind of start? And maybe you guys could kind of just give us a little bit of history around this.
Well, actually, Patricia's work goes back to sort of the beginning ideas on it. So maybe she could talk about where it came from, and then I can dovetail in with that when we start talking about where we've taken it over the last couple of years and why we've moved in that direction.
Yeah. So I'll try to make this quick. So once upon a time, 10 years ago, when I joined scrum.org, Ken Schraber was working on something called the continuous improvement framework and thinking about, enterprise scrum and how can we grow this throughout the organization. And at that time, the topic of scaling became really, really popular, right? Like everybody was, scrum is this. And then everybody said, everybody needs to be trained up in scrum. We all need to be agile and let's scale. And he said, hey, wait a second. If you're going to be doing that, how do you know that that's the right thing to do? And what evidence do you have? How do we actually inspect and adapt at an organizational level, or just what you're doing, right? And so the continuous improvement framework at that time seemed a little too early, but the notion of how do you know that Agile is actually working for you was the impetus of his conversation. And it also was, if you're going to spend a ton of money, train up 3,000 people or 35 teams or 250 teams, don't you want to know that you're actually going in the direction that makes sense and in pursuit of what. So we just talked about measurement. We were talking about measurement for a while, and we published the EBM guide. And at that time, there were 3 key value areas that we thought about, which was current value, where's the organization now in terms of, you know, what you have, your employees, your customers, and then your time to market and your ability to innovate. How would you look at those 3 things? And at that time, it was like, great, okay, so we're measuring those things, and then people will be like, okay, Patricia, we're measuring, this is really cool. What metrics do we use? And it kind of lost the point of what the measurement was for. And we thought that if people were thinking that they would inspect, that maybe they would think about how they would improve off of that. And then probably around that time, stage left, comes Kurt Bittner, and I said, you know, Kurt, we have this problem. And we started talking about unrealized value, which is, you know, can the corporation or can the teams get out of their own way and actually think about what's going on outside of the organization, start thinking about outcomes, and then adding that bit of empiricism back into it. So Kurt, if you want to add from there, that might be helpful.
Yeah. So for me, prior to coming to Scrum.org, I spent 3 years at Forrester Research, and when I was there, I was covering things like DevOps and Agile and other things, and I got really interested in things like value stream mapping and analyzing that. But what also got me thinking when I encountered EBM was that so we had this concept of current value, but there's this fundamental question when you're thinking about investing in, you know, product A or product B or initiative A or initiative B, is how much is good enough? And so, you know, the traditional problem that a lot of product managers and product owners have is that they just keep adding features. And, you know, most of those features actually don't do anything. There's some really interesting data that suggests that, you know, a third of the ideas that organizations have, this is Microsoft and Google and Amazon and, you know, pretty sophisticated organizations, a third of their ideas are good. They produce positive value, or they achieve the things that they were trying to achieve. A third of the things don't do anything, and a third of the things actually make things worse. So what that says is that 2/3 of the investment that these pretty successful organizations are making has no value or negative value. So it got me thinking, and as I read things like Lean UX and some other things, it got me thinking about, well, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to close a satisfaction gap that the customer has. And so the customer has the gap, and this gets back to some of the theory behind jobs to be done and outcome-driven innovation, and that the customer has this problem, whether you do anything or not. Now, your competitor might do something, but you know, so if you look at what you're trying to do as an organization, is you're trying to close these satisfaction gaps and hopefully monetize that closure, and that's how you're successful. So we thought about, you know, how do we've already got current value. We don't really want to mess with that because that's still an important thing. So let's add this concept called unrealized value, which for some people is really hard to wrap their heads around. How do you measure something that's not there? But in fact, there are a variety of ways that you can measure that. I used to work for a big software company, and you know, we did trials. People tried out the product, and you could, in a sense, measure unrealized value by looking at how many people who tried your product actually bought it, and use that as a proxy for the unrealized value. If many people didn't buy your product, there's obviously something missing from your product that they didn't get, or maybe they got from another product. And so trying to measure that unrealized value, you might measure it with, you know, as in a coarse-grained way with market share. You might measure it by surveys. You might measure it by, you know, actually instrumenting the application. But there's a variety of ways to measure unrealized value, and that gives you something that you can now base organizational goals off of. So the other thing that we added starting in 2016. And with the release that we came out with last year, I guess it was we added this notion of goals. And before our talk, before we started the podcast, we were chatting just amongst the three of us about Mike Rother's improvement kata. So, you know, I really liked that idea that he expressed in there, and so we kind of grafted the goals part of it onto this notion of these key value areas to understand. So strategic goals, if they're expressed in terms of unrealized value, that gives the organization something to shoot for over the long term. And then intermediate and short-term goals can be based on things like, it could be based on value, but it could also be based on, well, classic example of most organizations, they don't deliver very quickly. And so you might discover that you have a large unrealized value that you want to close. But if you're only shipping it once every 9 months, you're not going to close that very fast. And so your intermediate goals might be more around improving cycle time, or what we call time to market, or something around ability to innovate, which is essentially measures of effectiveness. Like, how much, in a sense, how much bang do you get for your buck? How effective you are at each release in delivering value. So the classic problem of ability to innovate is stuff like interruptions. So if you're attending meetings 90% of your time, and you're only working on valuable things 10% of your time, then your ability to innovate is going to be low. And each release that you do to customers is perhaps only going to move the value needle just a little bit each time, because you're not able to achieve focus. Anyway, I've kind of rambled a bit. But...
Well, the thing I want to add there, Kurt, just that ability to innovate, is that when I was with a client in Asia, and what you're talking about is, we know these things, and I think, meaning we're the teams, or we know that we're fixing things 90% of the time. But what I found was interesting, and especially, when you think about talking about metrics or these kind of things, they're there to spark a conversation, right? So what I care about is that there's a holistic look at it. But the interesting thing that I found is that the people who set the numbers and the budget and that assumption, they think one thing is happening. Money is being spent a certain way. And it's not actually until you dive into actually what are we doing and why is it that you can see there's this diff, and that conversation is something that I've seen EBM help some clients just kind of trigger those conversations with business leaders.
Well, you look under the hood and see how people are charging back codes in the old accounting system. And then I tell you, I've had to run the gamut of a lot of things. The last company I was at as the director of processing tools. So I saw everything. We helped set up the Agile PMO, which is kind of an oxymoron there, but we set up our Agile PMO. I had to own both the SPLCs. I had to work with the lady that did all the kind of, we did some basic venture style funding. And so I'd have to help the project managers figure out where all the money was going, and then how the chargeback codes were being applied. And I'm like, you've created a complexity mess here. But what it really did is it allowed us to really see what people were really doing or confused about how they were doing. And it allowed us to kind of go, wait, time out. There's a whole lot better way to do some of this accounting stuff and still be in compliance with CapEx and OpEx. So we were able to, kind of modify the processes there to allow the teams to spend less time doing time entry and more time actually writing the software, because it was a waste. But it's kind of, it's without looking at how money rolls up and but the average Agile coach isn't, or average Scrum Master isn't going to be exposed to that. So I guess, how do you get leaders thinking this way? Because I can tell you that the leaders weren't thinking about how somebody was charging time, and then how it impacts their ability, how much time they were basically wasting on or project managers were wasting correcting time, or we were showing too much CapEx or too much OpEx and things like that. So, I think this is all super interesting, and the data and the measures, but it's like, how do you get this into the right hands at the right level? Yeah. And to me, a lot of this feels like this is more for the organization, and you kind of touched on that really before we started recording. I think with all the buzzwords around OKRs, and everybody focused on OKRs, and most of the OKRs I've seen are just doing stuff. It's in the thing, it's about activity or outputs. Yeah. So most of the OKRs I've seen to date are based on the activity or output, and not actually outcome focused. So are the goals kind of targeted at like a replacement for OKRs? Do they work with it?
Yeah, well, yeah. So we'll sort of we'll unwind that by talking about OKRs first. Is that OKRs, if you focus them on outcomes, could be a really useful thing. You know, they said, here's an outcome that we'd like to achieve, and this is the evidence that we would expect to see if that outcome has been achieved. Now, that establishes a really useful way of having a discussion about what's important, and it would be useful for Scrum teams or Agile teams in general to understand that, so they can pick the right product backlog items and they can then work on the right things. The problem, as you mentioned, is that many OKRs are based on activities or outputs, and so it's basically, do these things. The OKR is do these things, or the OKR is somewhat fluffy, and the key results are do these things, or it's produce these things, and you have no idea. The teams have no idea why they're producing those things or doing those things, so it's not helpful. So OKRs could be useful, but sort of winding it back to your original question, we often go into organizations and we'll ask the question, why is it that you're doing this Agile initiative? And we often get an answer that's something like, well, we want to go faster, or we want to be more responsive, or we want to, be more efficient sometimes. And like good consultants, we apply our 5 whys technique and we say, great, why do you want to do that? What will going faster do for you? And then, they start to, actually they're a little confused at first sometimes, because of like, well, nobody's asked that. But eventually we get around to something that says that, well, we feel like our customers are going to run away to another competitor if we don't, if we're not able to keep pace with their expectations or something like that. And now we're onto something that goes back to that unrealized value concept. So we try to help them reframe their goal, not as going faster, being more efficient, but actually being more effective at delivering value. And now we've established, a conversation that we can kind of work with them to help them think about things in evidence-based management terms. And so we might say, well, how would you recognize that you've been successful? What evidence or what measures would tell you that you're being successful with that? And often also that results in some confusion, because they're not really sure how to do that. But at least we're now having a conversation about what would success look like, instead of just being Agile and adopting some superficial practices like, everybody's standing up at 8 o'clock in the morning. Well, great, Anyway, so it's mostly about trying to reorient the conversation towards real measures of value that are usually based on some customer measure of satisfaction, instead of some internally focused way of working.
Yeah, I'll share what I've seen is so OKRs are back. We know that, and the interesting thing is that, like Kurt said, if OKRs are used well, that's great. But a lot of people, they go, oh, OKRs, this is how I'm going to talk to management now. I can get that in, or this is a way management's going to communicate everything they want. So there's that. I'll just hit on the risky side of it. And all the things that we talk about when we're saying, hey, how do we make sure that this aligns to vision? How is this empowering anybody? A lot of that gets lost. So I've been talking to teams and they'll say, we've just been given OKRs and we're doing that, and there's no empiricism, because the problem is that there's an assumption that O is correct, right? So we're not actually learning to see, even if that was an outcome, we're not learning to see what's correct. So to see if we need to adapt, and especially in the times during the pandemic, I don't know, I wouldn't call this post-pandemic anymore, but there's really been something serious about how are we investing our money? How are we investing our time? What do we think about? How do we think about that step by step? And EBM, throughout the years, you can see that we've avoided aligning it up to saying, you must use Scrum to do this. It must be Agile. And is this something that's fancy? Is this for the question that might come in is this for, who does this? Is this product owners? Is this scrum masters? Is this coaches? Is this management? Is this just management porn? And I would say yes. So you would look at, we've seen a way that this information has allowed execs to get away from looking at just dots and lines on a graph, and they're looking at the progress of a product, which is amazing. And they can see that the teams understand that, you know, when you give them this wafty goal, now they understand they're making progress towards something rather than kicking out wikis. But I'm trying to find a way to gracefully insert this into the podcast, but it's a way to talk to people, I think, about, you know, evidence doesn't just mean data, but it's better than, you know, just, what did I just do? Put my finger up and see which way the wind's blowing. But it's also a way to avoid that notion, like, where agile has just become an overused term. Like you were saying, James, about how you say empiricism to somebody and their eyes glaze over. And I like to joke about how agile's become a dirty word like asshole. So there's another way to just talk about, actually, what are we trying to do here, right?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I'm all done with agile. No, pretty much. I'm not gonna lie. But you know, it's really interesting. And the last company we were talking about a lot of challenges, and we, instead of trying to, we had a you know, a glacier of a middle management layer. Instead of trying to, you know, just blame everything on all the slowness of the transformation on the middle management, we said we need to do something about it. We need to work on the culture. We need to help people, because matrix management there wasn't really good either. So like the leaders didn't know what to do. They're like, what do you mean? I'm supposed to coach people. I'm no skills in being able to coach people. I fight fires and I tell people what to do. That's my job. I'm the pointy headed manager. And we got talking about it. We got listening to their fears. And some of the stuff that we did was we were focused on a cultural transformation. And when we sold it to the executive, it was our measure of success was the organization would feel different. There would be less friction. There would be less people infighting. You would see more collaboration. And that's how we sold the measurement of what this thing was going to look like. And, you know, in pure skepticism, you know, he just said, fine, just you go do it. And, you know, the interesting thing is a year and a half later and 10 trips to India, and we've circled the globe on that one. You know, the organization did feel different. And he could actually say, when I'm in this office, which is that you can tell how long ago that was. That was circa end of 2019. But he's like, when I go to a site and I just see the people, I see the way that people are interacting, I interact with the managers, I can actually sense it. Like the organization feels different. And he's like, so you guys weren't totally wrong. And he's like, this is the first time I've ever had a non-qualitative kind of measure thrown out to me as a degree of success.
Well, we actually launched a class around EVM or a workshop, whatever, virtual, in July. And one of the exercises or the considerations that we ask people to think about that you just brought up is the notion of people. Because it's not just hard. People go, oh, what metrics do we have? Okay, what is that relationship if we can get beyond? What is that relationship between metrics and the goals? What does that look like? And then we've said, wait, human beings are complex. What is the relationship between the measures that you have, the people and their behaviors, and the goals? What would that look like? And how would that change if you're just pushing down on a system? What behaviors would you expect if people, you know, like there's a really interesting relationship there. And when I talk when we talk about that with execs, they go, oh, I never thought about that, like those 3 dimensions. And then you can see there's this outside force of this is what really reflects the values of an organization. So that relationship that you're just talking about right there, like the goals, measures, behaviors, and the values is super special.
Yeah, there's another thing too that, you know, relating to culture is that, I mean, people aren't completely motivated by money and rewards and things like that, but they are to some degree. And so, a lot of success in an initiative, if success is defined in terms of on time, on budget, there's nothing about value in that. It's two made up numbers, two numbers literally pulled out of the air that don't mean anything. Somebody guessed that, it would take this much time, and somebody guessed that it would take this much money. But if you reorient the measures of success to be, we want to close the satisfaction gap, or maybe even more concretely, we want to deliver these particular outcomes to customers that we think are going to help us be successful, then you figure out ways to measure those things, and you can tell whether the initiative or the thing you're working on was successful. But if you ask people, well, you delivered it on time, on budget, was a success, and virtually everybody says, I don't know, maybe, and so that's sort of the problem that I think a lot of organizations still who are doing, at least from an activity standpoint, doing good things around things like DevOps and continuous delivery, and they've automated large parts of the delivery pipeline. But if all they do is count successes, delivered and shipped, but they have no idea whether what they delivered was useful, they're kind of missing an opportunity that could motivate people and bring people together and help to start changing that culture. Because when you start getting everybody circled around doing good things for the customer, and there are measures that support whether you actually achieve something. Trish has a great story from a colleague that she works with more than I do, that you might want to tell that one about the teams that were greatly motivated because they actually had some goals that they could work against, and
that might.
Yeah, well, and so the thing was to make it more concrete is that, before this organization had very, very vague, the usual mission statement type of goals. We want to be the best, provider of services in our industry, and it all sounds wonderful, but it's all BS, because there are no measures of what the best is, and you can't actually target that. But when they came up with concrete measures that were oriented around customer outcomes, now the teams are like, hey, wait a minute, I got this idea how we could do that. Oh, I've got another idea how we do that. And they start getting more engaged. And so, you could measure the employee engagement, and you can measure the progress against that goal. And it's not just that the goal was being achieved, but actually things like engagement and employee satisfaction were much higher, because they now felt part of something, instead of just feeling like they're cogs in the machine that, you're turning out stuff and you have no idea whether anyone's ever using it.
And Kurt and I used to work at in research, and it's like we know that data of organizations say agile transformation is really working well, but the teams have no clue what the goal or the strategy is. And I actually want to take this in a different direction. I'm curious what you're thinking about or seeing, James, because you work with some big companies, but there's a PST when we're talking about evidence-based management. What she referenced and alluded to was the fact that in today's market conditions, she thinks that to achieve strategic goals or to achieve something like that, right? So the way that we think of outcome-driven, outcome-based goals, that empiricism is the only sustainable form of leadership. And I'm wondering, do you see that notion at all in the organizations you work with from a leadership perspective? Where they're starting to say, you know what, this we need to lead and think in a different way. And also from, I don't even want to say teams and high performing teams, but from individuals, are they engaged anymore, right? We've gone through some heavy crap over the last 2 years. And so people are probably are asking themselves, is this worth it? And so I know it's like, oh, I'm lucky to have a job, but there's also the notion that I'm seeing is I need to choose what's gonna be worth it. And so are those goals becoming more relevant?
So I mean, empiricism is a critical success factor in most of the organizations that we're at. It's, do they have the right understanding, the right measures, the right way to communicate, the value word there. Because we're working on a project right now with some of the teams that I'm kind of aligned to and help kind of supporting, and their OKR is tied to replacing the top 75% of the traffic pages in a portion of the website that's behind the login. And on the surface, like it's so demotivating for everybody. They're like, this goal is stupid, it's not manageable, we can't hit it. But the problem is the sales pitch, all they're really seeing and all they're hearing around the key results is that they're retiring web pages. They're moving to AWS and serverless front ends, which is super cool. They like the technology part. They like that they're learning new skills. But the piece that never made it to them and the communication paths around why we needed to do this, they didn't get that. They don't actually know the value that replacing these web pages are getting to. They didn't. If you're a new developer, most of the teams that they brought in are from a different area of the business, and they did it through like a casting call, like, hey, we've got these opportunities, come join us, or they hired from outside. And so you got these people that have no context of the system, what the history of it is. And it turns out that there's literally 3 versions of the website that are out there. And we're not talking like little versions of the website. We're talking full failover, redundancy. So like if your new modern cloud awesomeness died, you could go right back to DB2, all the old monolithic garbage, and be running in 2.5 hours. That's how long it takes to sync the data back, unless you lose the database and then you're boned. But in the grand scheme of things, so they're not looking at the fact that the company's literally just bleeding millions of dollars a year with teams to BAU it, teams to support it, teams to keep it up with the Joneses. And so like, because they were not connected, like the goal is good. The goal is going to save the company a large amount of money. It's going to allow them to move faster in the long run. That all they see it is I'm killing web pages for the company. And when you can reframe it for them that, yes, what you're doing kind of sucks because you're rebuilding web pages, in the long run, you're going to be able to go faster. Here's the roadmap of all the cool stuff that, and the net promoter score goals that we need to solve because we have a lot of high bounce rate, all those different kind of things that are on the roadmap that you can't get to till table stakes are done. And so like, I sat a group of them down and I went through this and I kind of showed them it all. And they're like, oh, well, all I get from my leader is we're replacing the web pages and we're going to serverless and AWS. And I'm like, well, I'm sorry that your leader can't explain to you the value of your job and the work that you're bringing to the company, and the fact that what you're doing now is kind of linchpin stuff that if we don't do this other kind of firm that starts with an F and ends with a Adelity is going to come and eat your lunch. Or Robinhood's going to come and their mobile app is going to take your younger generation of investors away. So like there's a lot of these people that they're not actually connected enough in the organization to understand why, even if the why isn't kind of showed to them. And so that's where I see the leaders kind of really falling down, is that disconnect. And because they're disconnected, because of some of it has some deadlines around it which weren't good. So you put a deadline on it that they have no inspiration on why they should care about doing it. And so now you've got a bunch of dissatisfied people that are, just kind of going through the motions. Once we started connecting some of those dots around why, the importance of it, the fact that we're building for the future, it was about a 50-50 kind of pivot.
Yeah.
50% of them still hate it, and the other 50% are like, oh crap, they're right, we need to do this. So
yeah, it's kind of like, oh, why do I need to drink water? Like, at least you understand it, and it's healthy for you, but it's the most exciting thing. That's a connection that I've heard a lot between, how are we using OKRs and Scrum, and how did EBM help improve that? Because there was this notion around the outputs versus outcomes. So what you're talking about, the goals, we talk about that coming from unrealized value. We're trying to look at an opportunity there. I think between a problem and a solution is that value, and should we close it? And EBM usually comes back and says, okay, well, how are you going to measure to know that this is working, and if we should move? Because we were talking to a client in a bank, same thing, where they wanted to replicate the entire website onto a mobile app. And then they actually studied what the customers did. And they said, customers don't want to do that. We're wasting our money here. And they were able to do things a lot quicker and save a lot of money. That was interesting for the teams.
And that brings up an important part of EBM that we haven't talked about, is that so basically every improvement cycle, which in Scrum terms would be a sprint, every improvement cycle is really a kind of experiment that you're running about value or about your organizational capability to deliver value. So in the example that you just gave, James, and actually tying with what Trish said, is that if you took a sprint or two and did that experiment to say, what if we did convert all of these things to serverless, and we retired a bunch of web pages and whatever, would that actually help us achieve the organizational goal? And the answer you get might be, yeah, great, and in which case you do more. Or it might be, no, we found out we need to do something different and it's not that important. So, there's a lot of assumptions that organizations make about what the right thing to do is. And this is sort of the flaw about OKRs, is that the usual assumption that people make about OKRs is that the objective is right, and the performance against the objective is the thing that could fall short. But actually, you might find that if you run an experiment, the objective isn't the right objective either, and you need to kind of reject that and improve your objective to be focused on the right thing. And so, this notion of inspecting and adapting both results and the goals is really important. And so, this experiment loop is really a way of testing that. Or we use the term experiment loop because we wanted to make it not dependent upon Scrum, but if you think about the experiment loop being a sprint, you have a sprint goal, and then you do some things and you check to see whether do we achieve that goal. And one of the questions that you ask in the sprint review is, was that the right goal? How do we do against the goal? But maybe that wasn't the right goal either. And we learned some things that tell us we could do better, have a better goal next sprint, and then you improve it. So trying to get organizations to think that the leadership assumptions might be wrong and the goals might be wrong. And this is a way of testing those things too, not just basically having goals come down from on high and then the teams are like, yes, sir, we right away, sir, and all that sort of thing. So anyway, that ends up being really important. And not every organization's open to that, because a lot of traditional organizations are used to having leaders sort of act unquestioned. But opening them up and say, look, not everybody is going to be right all the time, and it's okay to learn from things. And I think one of the brilliant things about, if you've seen that video about SpaceX, and the landing failures on the Falcon rocket and whatever, and what they learned each time, it's just brilliant. And then finally, at the last time when they landed perfectly, there's cheers and everything else, but that being open to testing your assumptions, I think is really important to improving business performance overall, not just looking at agile teams as being just focused on execution and the orders come down from leadership. The information needs to flow both ways.
No, I totally agree with you. And I think one of the interesting things is you didn't call out a sprint. You didn't really hit on a time box, but every good experiment, every kind of all this stuff, it should be time based. So logically, it does fit into an organization, and which is, we also have some of those kind of interesting challenges where we're starting to kind of push people to a common cadence, a common 250 teams working on one clock. Which has had its own interesting issues, but even having the Kanban team starting to calculate their cycle time and throughput on that same time box, they still hold the retros and some reviews during those same kind of time boxes. So having an actual rhythm, having an understanding of an experiment horizon, how long is this thing going to run? Do we stop it early if we're seeing like failure patterns? I think that's one of the kind of critical things that, the last place when I was at the company before this one, we sat down, and when we defined an experiment, we defined what is the failure scenario. So if we're not at around this point and we're not seeing these results, it's probably time to look at it and pivot. And I think that that's one of those kind of key important things for folks to realize, that you're not going to get your experiments right all the time. You're going to have to understand how long. Generally, some of these changes or some of these experiments don't happen overnight. So what is that longest responsible window that you can have to evaluate your experiment?
Well, that sounds like I mean, that sounds like common sense in life too, right? Like when you think about it, it just makes sense.
Well, you would think so, but like I literally have to explain this to 55-year-old executives that have 2 master's degrees and have been in, a leader of product for the better part of 40 years. And it's
well, you could say like, sir or madam, if you're not here, you won't be able to retire by the time you're 60. I'm sure you have something in place. No, I'm kidding. But I think that the thing you're bringing up about time boxes is really important, because when Ken Schwaber, he and I were just talking last week about this, but we were talking about scaling a while back, and we were just having this conversation again. And somebody had told him, our goals are too big and broad, like they can't fit into 30 days or less, whatever. And he said, well, you're breaking empiricism. How else are you going to know? And that's that, I don't know if you called it a dirty word or nasty word or the word value, like how will you know? If you don't have that cadence. And we just talk about, at least there must be a common denominator. Are they always on 2 weeks? No, but should they be able to sync at some time? Yes, because we need to have that.
Up to a month. You get a month.
Yeah.
No.
Well, this was one of the reasons why in EBM, when we did that kind of grafting with improvement kata ideas, is that strategic goals, usually over kind of a 3 to 5 year horizon. And of course, that doesn't fit into a 2-week sprint or a 4-week sprint. Intermediate goals might be somewhere between a quarterly and a year, but you've got something equivalent to a sprint goal or a short-term tactical goal that needs to be sort of every 2 to 4 weeks. And so, you're using empiricism to seek towards longer term goals. So, life wouldn't work very well if you simply had short term, I've got a goal for this week, right? Nothing beyond that. But it also doesn't work very well if you've got, I've got a goal in 5 years to, have a PhD in something, but, I have no idea what I'm doing the next week or the next 2 weeks. So we felt like those 3 timescales actually worked rather well, especially with most organizations. They need quarterly goals, but they need something bigger than that. But they also need something smaller than that, that's more tactical, that you could do in a sprint or in a couple of weeks to test some of your ideas. And then you're sort of inspecting and adapting and seeking toward these goals and adapting the goals like we talked about earlier. So yeah, that's why that three levels of goals ended up being, we felt like, an important thing, that you kind of need all 3 of them to actually tie it together.
No, I like the levels of goals and the description in the guide. I think it's really well. I don't like that the names are close together. It's that tactical.
Yeah.
I like the people that I work with will literally be like drooling on themselves and confused and telling me that I'm confused. I don't know what you're talking about.
Well, if you have some suggestions,
I
they
don't
can
know.
always just tell you and your friends and the zombies, just send Kurt Bittner, and even I'm kidding, they can contact
well, here's Kurt's email. Just email him your suggestions.
just email Kurt. He's waiting.
But it's
He's all.
We need to find the email equivalent of Deb Null.
And I know we're kind of coming up on the time box here, but I did want to just kind of send this out on the whole value note, and it kind of being a dirty word. I think it's more that people confuse like what is value. Everybody describes it like our industry has polluted the word value. Well, not necessarily you guys, but everybody else. Like I literally in a demo today with sitting there looking at Lean Kit, and since Plainview bottom, I'm not sure what happened. It's still pretty good. It's not as good as the old days, but like I'm literally looking at a screen that's showing about the super value calculating wizard machine where you put in your features and you fill in the, these 10 check boxes, and then voodoo and magic happens, and then you get a value score. And this thing is valuable because it's 99 points, and this one's not as valuable because it's 62 points. And I'm like, WTF, people, this isn't value. And
No,
that's
it's not,
why
but it sounds really fun and easy.
it is. AHA has the same kind of thing built into their product, and I'm like, people, this is not value. Like, we need a good definition of value that people can adopt and live with.
Well, so value calculators like that, I sometimes joke that they're derived from this branch of mathematics that's known as numerical proctology. Yeah, they pull numbers out of somewhere. That's the one thing I think that we tried when we talk about value. We try to focus on the satisfaction gap as being sort of the source of value creation, and so it's really based on desired outcomes that customers have, whether they concretely understand them. So an example that I sometimes bring up, for those of us who remember when the first iPhone came out, one of the comments was from the business community is like, people will never use that because it doesn't have a keyboard. And the people over at BlackBerry were saying the same thing, like, well, we're secure because it doesn't have a keyboard. Well, it turns out that people didn't really want a keyboard. They just want an easy way of interacting with things. And what they actually valued more was having, a nice interface to web content. So they were willing to do swiping and virtual keyboards on the screen and all that, because that satisfied their desired outcome adequately, actually better than BlackBerry did. So this notion of desired outcomes, I think, is more useful because it's something that you can then translate into discussions about, or inject into discussions about, well, how do we close that gap? If there's this satisfaction gap, first of all, how do we test that it's actually real? And two, how do we close that gap? And so, yeah, I wish we had a better term about value, but yeah, any kind of, pointing score or weighted scores on product backlog items, it's like, no, that's just, I mean, the problem with estimates. So there's a problem with estimates is that I love this. There's some guys who had a blog a while ago, and they I don't know if they're still doing it. I should be embarrassed about that, but it was the blog was 39 signals or something like that. And so they produced this book, and it was like, really nice, easy read. And one of their topics said that basically estimating is guessing, which was a really nice way of thinking about it. So whenever you have, sort of like a time and a value estimate on a product backlog item, you're guessing about the value, and you're guessing about the time, or you're guessing about the work involved. And both of those might be wrong. In fact, both of them probably are wrong. It's just, are they wrong to an insignificant degree? And so, when you run those experiments each sprint, some of your experiments should be about, is our estimate of value really true? How do we know that, we delivered this stuff, we thought it was valuable, was it really true, and get some feedback on that. So I guess the point about value is that it's all, it kind of goes back to it's in the eyes of the customer, not in the eyes of the observer. But so if a customer thinks it's valuable and they're willing to pay money to solve the problem, then it's valuable. And if it doesn't close the satisfaction gap, and they're not willing to pay something to have that gap closed, then it wasn't valuable. And I think for me, when I put it in those terms, then the value discussion is really easy, and it gets less esoteric.
Several years ago, a senior level scrum master said, Patricia, can you come talk to our leadership team? Because, we're doing this agile transformation, and they say they care about value, but we're not even sure they actually know what it is. So could you just come and talk to them, and we'll use the measurement conversation to see what they want to measure, so that we can get an insight into what they think is value, right? And so that was also an impetus around EBM. And I remember at that point, we used to talk about, so we mentioned those 4 key value areas. as business value and thinking about business agility. And we used to talk about it a lot that way. And if you think about it, and what Kurt was saying, we used to talk about current value as, that's right now, think about the market value, and then unrealized value as future value. And I know that there's some people who talk about different types of values, but there's this notion of your ability to innovate and your time to market. You might consider those as steps around efficiency. So is efficiency a value? Is that something for nonprofits? Is that something for insurance companies who don't want customers or who don't want people actually using their service? How do they think about that? And so there's a reason why those things are called the KVAs, the 4 key value areas, because that's a way to think about them. But again, to think about all those things holistically if we're actually satisfying demand. And I think it's also pointing to another area where we talk about product ownership and we talk about products and an understanding of the different stakeholders that we have will cause us to think about value in different ways too. And I think the question becomes, is that actually a value conversation? Or is that just a person who's in a layer of fat and wants to participate or something like that?
I thought you were going to go down a path of, so Trish and I were working with this one particular organization and running a workshop, and we could tell almost from the outset, they were really struggling with what value was. And we were getting into these very esoteric conversations. And so to sort of get them to focus, we sort of stopped the conversation and said, try this for a second. Instead of asking, how do you measure value? Ask, how do your customers measure value? And all of a sudden,
here was the exact question. What do your customers want from your product? What do they use? What are they trying to achieve? What are they trying to achieve? Go measure that. And they were like, we have that information in our systems. Oh.
Yeah, it just cut through all the sort of waffling and sort of vague discussions, because for their customers, it was very clear. It had to do with shortening the amount of time that took for them to get paid by their customers, because it was a sort of a SaaS application that helped them do billing. So once that insight is sort of, everybody in the room agreed on that. And all of a sudden, then the conversations completely changed about how do we get there? And so I think that's a useful question to ask is, if you're struggling with what's valuable, ask, how would your customers measure value, or what do they consider valuable? And if you don't know that, then run some experiments to figure it out. But
and it was totally just what do your customers want to do with that product? And then finally it became the product people were in there and it goes, oh, wait, now we want to talk to the development people. We want to talk. And then what they did with the value stream is they found that what was holding them back was actually the sales conversation. So this was really interesting. But we're on a podcast, so people don't know you made a face, James, and you might want to participate in the conversation.
No. I mean, those are all super interesting kind of points. And it's generally aligns with around how I generally talk about value and what we're trying to actually solve. It's good to hear other people talk about it, because the number of people I think we've had on the show that have talked about value and what it is, and it's just it's good. Sometimes it's good to have that affirmation of like the crap that you've been.
Is everybody saying the same thing? Or is it, so are we?
It's all over the damn place. Like, just, if I hear Wischiff one more time and them being like, how we really, that's real value. Or we ran into, who's Steve McConnell's guy, John Clifford. I don't want to talk bad about consultants on the podcast, but like putting relative points for the value of something. And then like he goes on the relative point matrix, and then you go across and, oh, look, it's here on this grid and it's here on this spot. These two are different. This one's way more important. And I'm like, John, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard about talking about value. Like, this customer, he cares about, does his electronic health record show up? Can he easily get it? can more of these forms pre-fill so that the nurse practitioner that's coming in to take the patient's blood pressure doesn't have to fill in the same data on 88 screens. And at some point in time, he screwed it up, which then reported to my JPMC health insurance wellness screening that Cigna's going to screw up. Now I didn't get my extra $500 on my freaking FSA because of we were focused on the wrong dang thing. Now, and that's the reality of like half
the
of
magic 8 ball didn't tell you that, did it? The magic 8 ball was like, nope, 3.
No. But it's so like there's just a lot of just people out there just talking about this stuff in totally random ways that really just confuse people. And then like I end up finding myself trying to clean this up and get people into a better situation when they're talking about actual value.
I might want to add this, like, because you talked about the framing, which was really important. And one of the things we looked at, which really from an EBM lens, when you think about the KBAs and the experiments that they have to run, but in Germany, there was this whole thing about vaccination, right? And so COVID, no, it wasn't about the vaccine. It was, they set up an app
contact tracing.
Yeah, contact tracing. And they were doing that. And they were saying, okay, when we have that, so if you go to a restaurant, we're going to know if there's an exposure. Great, sign up for that. And they were having such success with people signing up. The government invested millions of euros into it. Guess what happened? Security breach. So now we have another opportunity. There's a quality problem, and that becomes this notion of, should we close that? So that's unrealized value, right? That we have a problem. We want to know, as people on the street about contact tracing and all those things, but we don't want our data out there for everybody potentially. So that's another thing to think about, like what you're saying, of all the framing of how we have to think about things, and can we do that? What's the cost? Is the experiment? Do we just anonymize the data? How does that work?
Awesome. Well, I want to be mindful of your guys' time. It is late, except for Kurt. It's like early evening. He's got hours of drinking left time to do. I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
As do we. Okay.
I turned into a pumpkin at 11. So I really appreciate you guys bringing this topic to the show. I always enjoy talking to the folks at Scrum.org. You've got a great group of people kind of running around down there or up there or everywhere now.
Wherever we are now.
Yeah.
So
we're in the cloud now.
You're on AWS too? Awesome. So I really appreciate you guys kind of coming on. If there, we'd like to give you guys an opportunity if you're got anything going on, anything you'd like to plug, if people want to connect with you, where could they find you? We'll just kind of wrap it up there, because I could talk to you guys for literally hours. And I'm sober tonight, which is not a usual thing for a podcast. But
well, you should maybe do another one where we have happy hour and do a real uprising of topics. Sure. I'm very good at that.
It reminds me of something that Oscar Wilde said. He said, "I drink to make other people more interesting." So maybe that's So I think the main thing for me is that we have this free guide to evidence-based management. You can find it at scrum.org. Pretty easy read, less than 20 pages, and references some other blogs and other, we've got some case studies and other blogs and supporting material. But read the guide. See if it resonates with you, and not you, but just the listeners. Maybe try out some of the ideas. Just get started. I mean, that's one of our things, is that you don't have to boil the ocean to use this. You can get started by just kind of thinking about your goals and trying to think about how would you know if you achieve those goals, and that's a good starting point for the conversation, and see where it goes. So try it, and hopefully you'll get something out of it, and then you can reach out to us at scrum.org, and if you have questions, comments, suggestions, just clarifications. So I guess that's my ask or suggestion, is that just learn more about it if it sounds interesting.
Yeah. So if people want to talk more, or hit us up talking about EBM or enterprise agility or leadership or those things. We're both available on LinkedIn. They can ask questions there. I think for me, it's also check out the guide, but we're an information radiator. So there's not to drive people off your podcast, but like I just recorded a session about ask us anything about EBM. So we just took a field of questions. We have webinars on the scrub.org website where I talked about the OKR and EBM, how we did that with some clients in Asia Pacific. And then because we're having this conversation about EBM where people can start to think about what value is, Kurt and I are interested in looking at, now that you know that, how would we invest for it? How do you start thinking about that from the flip side of the coin, which is an important conversation. And then we're just interested in some conversations about leadership and power and organizations and stuff like that, status quo. So that's cool stuff.
So thanks again to our guests, Patricia Kong and Kurt Bittner, and to you, our listening audience. If you'd enjoyed this episode, please give us a review and rating and leave a comment on iTunes, Stitcher, or your podcasting platform of choice. It really helps us. It really helps others find us. If this is your first time tuning in, why don't you subscribe to our podcast? And we used to have a Discord or Discourse server. It's still out there, and you can find that at coalition.agileuprising.com. There's a lot of great articles and content that people wrote out there. But really, right now, if you want to come to the live action, come find us on Discord, and there'll be a link in the show notes for that. And if you like what you're hearing and you want to support us, we try to keep this podcast free for everybody. We do have a Patreon, and you can find that in the show notes too. So with that, I'm James, and we're signing off on the Agile Uprising podcast. Have a great sometime in your day.